The ladle trembled in Isolde Nightshade's hands as she recognized the face beneath. The dried blood and battlefield grime, the same face she'd kissed goodbye 3 years ago. The same eyes that had promised to return before the first cannon fire of the war swallowed him whole. The makeshift field hospital carved into the hillside. Cave reeked of carbolic acid and suffering, but Isolde had grown accustomed to stirring hope into her soup kettles while men screamed in the shadows. She'd been ladling broth for the wounded since dawn, calloused fingers moving with practiced grace born of necessity and heartbreak. The Confederate forces had retreated through these Tennessee mountains, leaving behind their broken bodies, like scattered leaves after a storm. But this face, Lord have mercy, this was Draven Ashwind, her dead fiancé, her buried love. The man whose funeral she'd attended in a black dress that still hung in her wardrobe, like a monument to grief. Draven's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and fever-bright. A musket ball had torn through his shoulder, and infection had set in fierce. His breathing came shallow and quick, the way a trapped animal pants before it gives up the fight. Isolde's heart hammered against her ribs as she knelt beside his stretcher, the wooden bowl of broth forgotten in her hands. "Water," he whispered, voice cracked like autumn bark. She didn't trust her voice, so she simply tilted a tin cup to his lips. His eyes met hers for one electric moment, and she saw no recognition there. None at all. The fever had burned away his memory, or perhaps the war had stolen it, or maybe this was God's cruel mercy. He drank greedily, water running down his stubbled chin. "Thank you, miss," he mumbled, before his eyes rolled back in unconsciousness. Claimed him again, miss. Not Isolde, not his beloved, not the woman who'd waited 2 years past hope before accepting that he must be dead in some unnamed battlefield grave. Dr. Thalia Ravenshade appeared at Isolde's shoulder, her surgical apron stained with the day's work. "This one came in with the last wagon," she said, checking Draven's pulse with professional efficiency. "Found him half dead in a ditch outside Murfreesboro. Been burning with fever for days. I'm not certain he'll last the night." Isolde's throat constricted. "What's his name?" "Haven't gotten it out of him yet. Keeps muttering about roses." And a woman named Thalia paused, studying Isolde's face. "You've gone white as milk, child. You know this soldier?" The lie came easier than breathing. "No, he just... reminds me of someone." Talia nodded and moved on to the next cot, but Isolde remained frozen beside Draven's still form. 3 years ago, she'd received the telegram that shattered her world. Regret to inform Draven Ashwind. Killed in action Chickamauga stop remains, not recovered stop. She'd grieved him proper, worn black for a full year and only recently begun. To imagine a future that didn't include his ghost at every meal, now here he lay, live and breathing, and completely unaware that she existed. The cave hospital buzzed with constant activity, orderlies carrying bloodied bandages, nurses spooning medicine into slack mouths, the soft prayers of a chaplain over the dying. Isolde moved through it all like a sleepwalker, heating broth and grinding herbs and pretending her world hadn't just tilted sideways. Every few minutes her eyes drifted back to Draven's corner, watching the rise and fall of his chest. When evening shadows crept into the cave, she approached his stretcher with a fresh bowl of broth and clean bandages. His fever had broken slightly, and his eyes tracked her movement with more clarity than before. "You're the angel with the soup," he said, attempting a weak smile. "Just a woman with a ladle." She helped him sit up enough to drink.
"What do you
remember about yourself?" His brow furrowed with concentration. "Fragments. A horse named Thunder. Smell of magnolias. And ... double quotes." He touched his chest absently. "Someone used to call me by a pet name, but I can't recall what it was. Bear. She'd called him Bear because of his broad shoulders and the way he'd wrap her in his arms like a protective embrace. But she bit her tongue and simply nodded. Memory's a funny thing," she said instead. "Sometimes it comes back in pieces." "Have you been here long?" he asked, studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "In this place? I mean, long enough?" She adjusted his blankets with gentle hands. "Rest now. You need your strength. As she turned to leave, his fingers caught her wrist. Same touch that once made her dizzy with longing, now foreign and electric with possibility. What's your name, Angel? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. She could tell him the truth and watch recognition slowly dawn in his eyes. Or she could become someone new, someone without the weight of their shared past. Someone who might learn to love him again without the ghost of their former selves standing between them. Alira, she said, using her middle name, Alira Dawnspire. Repeated it softly, as if testing how it felt in his mouth. Alira, that's pretty. Squeezed his hand once and pulled away, her heart racing with equal parts joy and terror. Outside the cave, thunder rumbled through the mountains. She wondered if storms always came when the dead returned to life. But as she began preparing the evening meal, grinding corn and chopping wild onions by lamplight, one terrible thought kept echoing in her mind. If Draven was alive, who lay in that grave back home marked with his name? The question haunted Isolde through 3 sleepless nights as she tended to Draven's recovery, spooning broth between his lips and changing his bandages while he called her. Lyra, in that voice she'd once known better than her own heartbeat. His shoulder wound began to heal clean, the angry red fading to pink under her careful ministrations. Dr. Ravenshade remarked on his remarkable constitution, how quickly he'd turned the corner from death's door. But Isolde knew it had nothing to do with constitution and everything to do with the stubborn will that had always defined Draven, the same iron determination that had driven him to propose marriage at 17 and enlist at 22. Despite her tears, "Tell me about yourself, Alira," he said on the 4th morning, propped against the cave wall while she stirred honey into his coffee. The other wounded men slept fitfully around them, but dawn had brought a strange intimacy to their corner of the hospital. Not much to tell. She kept her eyes on the tin cup, afraid her face would betray her. "I grew up in these mountains, lost my family to the fever, to winters past." The lie sat bitter on her tongue. Her family lived safely in Nashville, believing their daughter worked as a seamstress for wealthy ladies. They had no idea she'd followed the army to ease her grief, that she'd become one of the nameless women who appeared wherever soldiers needed tending. "I'm sorry for your loss." His fingers brushed hers as he took the coffee, and she nearly dropped the cup. "You have kind hands, gentle but strong. They remind me of ... He frowned, chasing a memory that wouldn't come. Someone I've forgotten. I think perhaps forgetting is a mercy sometimes, perhaps. But his eyes lingered on her face with a puzzlement that made her stomach churn. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" Before she could answer, commotion erupted. At the cave entrance, soldiers in blue uniforms poured in Union cavalry, their sabers drawn and eyes hard with purpose. The cave fell silent except for the groans of the wounded. Nobody moved, barked their lieutenant, a scarred man with cold eyes. "We're searching for Confederate deserters?" Dr. Ravenshade stepped forward, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "This is a hospital, Lieutenant. These men are wounded, not deserters, asked for us to determine." His gaze swept the rows of stretchers, like a hawk surveying prey. "Papers now. Every man who can speak." Isolde's blood turned to ice. Draven had no papers, no identification beyond the tattered gray uniform they'd cut from his body. Worse, his accent marked him as Virginia gentry, exactly the kind of officer the Union wanted to capture or hang. The lieutenant moved methodically, down the rows, checking documents, interrogating those conscious enough to answer. 2 soldiers flanked him, rifles ready. When he reached Draven's stretcher, Isolde stepped protectively closer. "This man's barely conscious," she said quickly. Took a musket ball to the shoulder and lost considerable blood. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed as he studied Draven's face. "You look familiar, boy. What's your name and unit?" Draven blinked slowly, still weak from fever. I don't remember." "Convenient." The lieutenant grabbed Draven's chin, turning his face toward the lamplight. "You've got the look of an officer about you. Soft hands, clean teeth, not some farmer's son." "He's nobody," Isolde said desperately. "Just a private who got separated from his unit." "Oh, let him speak for himself." The lieutenant drew his pistol and pressed it to Draven's temple. Last chance, Johnny Reb. Name and unit, or I'll assume you're a spy. The cave held its breath. Isolde watched terror flicker across Draven's face, not fear of death, but fear of the blank spaces in his mind where answers should have been. She could see him struggling, grasping for identity like a drowning man reaching for rope. "Thomas," she said suddenly. "Thomas Ironmore? He's my husband?" Every eye in the cave turned to her. The lieutenant's pistol never wavered, but his attention shifted to Isolde with predatory interest. "Your husband?" "Yes, sir. We're Thomas Ironmore of the 12th Tennessee Infantry. We married just before he enlisted." The lies flowed like water now, each one carrying her further from shore. "He took that ball at Stones River and hasn't been right in the head since." The lieutenant studied them both with calculating eyes. "Funny. He doesn't wear a wedding ring." Isolde's mind raced. Lost it in the river when he fell from his horse, nearly drowned too. That's when the fever took hold and scrambled his wits. "She speaks the truth," Draven said quietly, his voice stronger now. He reached for Isolde's hand with trembling fingers. "I may not remember much, but I remember her. My wife." The words sent lightning through Isolde's chest. The way he said it, the conviction in his voice, despite the confusion in his eyes, was as if some deeper part of him recognized the truth of what they'd once been to each other. The lieutenant holstered his pistol, but didn't move away. "If he's your husband, you won't mind proving it?" "What do you mean?" "Kiss him like a wife would kiss her husband." Heat flooded Isolde's cheeks, but she didn't hesitate. She knelt beside Draven's stretcher and cupped his face in her hands. The way she had 1,000 times before the war stole him away. His skin felt fever-warm beneath her palms, familiar despite everything that had changed. "Thomas," she whispered, putting all her love and loss into his borrowed name. Then she kissed him. His lips were chapped from fever, but they remembered her. She felt his sharp intake of breath, the way his body tensed with recognition his mind couldn't grasp. For one perfect moment, they were 21 again, and the world was full of possibility instead of graves. When she pulled away, Draven's eyes were wide with wonder and confusion. "I know you," he breathed. "I know you, but I don't understand." "How?" The lieutenant watched this exchange with grudging satisfaction. "Well enough, but I'm leaving 2 men to keep watch. If this Thomas remembers anything suspicious about his service, they'll bring him in for proper questioning." As the Union soldiers took positions near the cave entrance, Dr. Ravenshade approached Isolde with worried eyes. "That was either very brave or very foolish," she murmured. "What happens when his memory returns, when he remembers his real name?" Isolde touched her lips where Draven's kiss still tingled like a brand. "I don't know, and if those soldiers discover you've lied, well, then I suppose we'll all hang together." Dr. Ravenshade squeezed her shoulder. "Love makes fools of us all, child. But sometimes fools are the only ones brave enough to save what matters." That evening, as Isolde ladled stew into wooden bowls, she caught Draven watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. He looked like a man trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "Illyra," he called softly. She approached his stretcher with careful steps. "How are you feeling?" Confused. He caught her hand and studied her, fingers with intense focus. "You said I was your husband, but you introduced yourself as Illyra Dawnspire, not Ironmore." The trap she'd built around them both tightened like a noose. I kept my maiden name. Some women do, especially when ... When what?" She met his searching gaze and saw something dangerous. They're not suspicion exactly, but a growing awareness. That the world around him didn't quite fit together the way it should. When they're not entirely certain their husband will return from war, she finished quietly. Draven's grip on her hand tightened. "What else aren't you telling me, wife?" The question hung between them like a loaded rifle, and Isolde felt the weight of every lie she'd told pressing against her chest. But before she could answer, a new commotion erupted outside the cave. The thunder of approaching hooves and shouting voices that made every wounded Confederate reach instinctively for weapons they no longer possessed. Yankees, someone hissed from the cave mouth. Whole company riding hard. Dr. Ravenshade appeared at Isolda's shoulder, her face grim. They're not stopping, riding past like the devil himself is chasing them. Through the cave entrance, Isolda glimpsed blue uniforms streaming past in the moonlight, their horses lathered with sweat and fear. The Union soldiers who'd been guarding the hospital rushed outside, shouting questions at their fleeing comrades. "What news?" the lieutenant bellowed. "Forests. Cavalry," came the panicked reply. "2 divisions, maybe 3. They've broken through at Spring Hill, and they're riding this way." The name sent a ripple of hope through the Confederate wounded. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the wizard of the saddle, the man who seemed to appear and disappear like smoke. Cavalry was coming. It meant rescue for some and capture for others. The Union lieutenant's face went pale. How far out? Maybe an hour? They're cutting down everything in their path. Within minutes, the blue-coated soldiers had mounted and disappeared into the night, leaving the cave hospital unguarded for the first time in days. The silence that followed felt pregnant with possibility and danger. "We need to move the wounded who can travel," Dr. Ravenshade announced. "If Forrest's men are coming, this place will become a battlefield." Draven struggled to sit up, his shoulder wound still seeping through fresh bandages. "I can ride, can barely stand," Isolda protested. "I won't be caught in a sickbed when Confederate cavalry arrives." His voice carried a note of authority that made several nearby soldiers look up with interest. Despite his lost memories, command seemed to flow through him like blood. As the hospital erupted into organized chaos, orderlies, helping mobile patients to their feet. Nurses gathering medical supplies, Isolda found herself facing an impossible choice. If Forrest's cavalry arrived and recognized Draven, her deception would crumble. But if they fled with the Union-controlled wounded, she might lose him forever to whatever new identity he'd built from the ashes of his amnesia. "There's something I need to tell you," she said quietly, helping him stand on unsteady legs. Before she could continue, a new voice cut through the darkness, cultured, familiar, and cold as winter steel. Well, Thomas Ironmore, is it?" Isolda's blood turned to ice, standing in the cave entrance, silhouetted against the star-scattered sky. It was Corwin Blackthorn, Draven's cousin, his closest friend before the war, and the man who'd delivered. The telegram announcing Draven's death, Corwin wore the uniform of a Confederate major, his brass buttons gleaming in the lamplight. His pale eyes swept the cave with predatory intelligence before settling on Draven's face with something that looked dangerously like recognition. "Major Blackthorn," Dr. Ravenshade said carefully, "are you with Forrest's command?" "Scout patrol," Corwin replied, his gaze never leaving Draven, checking for Union stragglers. He stepped closer, his boots echoing against stone. "But I find something much more interesting." A dead man walking, Draven frowned, swaying slightly from weakness. "I'm sorry, Major, but I don't believe we've met. Haven't we?" Corwin's smile was sharp as a blade. "You don't remember me, cousin?" The word hit like a thunderclap. Several wounded soldiers gasped, and Isolda felt the world tilt beneath her feet. If Corwin was here, if he recognized Draven, then everything, every lie, every desperate gamble would unravel like a poorly sewn seam. "Cousin," Draven repeated, confusion and hope warring in his voice. "Draven Ashwind, of Ashwin Hall, Virginia." Corwin circled them slowly like a wolf. "Studying wounded prey. Though I suppose that name means nothing to you now, does it? How convenient that you've forgotten everything, including your obligations, Draven." The name escaped Isolda's lips as a whisper. Corwin's cold eyes fixed on her with sudden interest. "And who might you be, miss? Though I suspect I already know." Now Dr. Ravenshade stepped protectively closer to Isolda. "She's this man's wife, Mrs. Ironmore." Corwin laughed to sound like breaking glass. "His wife? How fascinating. Tell me, Mrs. Ironmore, when exactly did you marry my dear cousin? Before or after his funeral?" The cave fell silent, except for the drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Every wounded man who could still think clearly was following this exchange with the intensity of spectators at a hanging. "I don't know what you're talking about," Isolda said, but her voice betrayed her. "Don't you?" Corwin reached into his jacket and withdrew a small leather case. "Perhaps this will refresh your memory." He opened the case to reveal a daguerreotypo wedding portrait of a young couple in their finest clothes. The woman wore white silk and orange blossoms, her hand resting on the man's shoulder as he sat beside her with obvious pride. Isolde's knees nearly buckled. It was Draven and his actual wife, Margaret Starcrest, the Richmond belle he'd married, just 6 months before enlisting. The woman whose existence had shattered Isolde's world and sent her fleeing to the mountains. My cousin married Miss Margaret Starcrest in the spring of 1862. Corwin continued conversationally, a lovely girl from one of Virginia's finest families. I was his best man. Snapped the case shut. You can imagine my surprise at finding him here, alive, and apparently married to someone else entirely. Draven stared at the closed case as if it contained the mysteries of the universe. I was married to this Margaret? Oh yes, quite the society wedding. Your father spent a fortune on the celebration. Corwin's smile turned predatory. Of course. Poor Margaret believes herself a widow. Has been wearing black for 3 years now, living on your family's charity. I wonder how she feel when she learns her husband has been playing house with a mountain woman. The cruelty in his voice made Isolde's hands clench into fists. How do you know he's really your cousin? He could be anyone, could he? Corwin stepped closer to Draven and pushed up his left sleeve, revealing a crescent-shaped scar on his forearm. Got that scar when we were 12, racing horses through a briar patch. I dared him to jump the creek, and he took the dare because Draven Ashwin never could resist proving he was braver than everyone else. Draven stared at the scar as if seeing it for the first time. I remember the pain, he said slowly. Sharp thorns, and someone laughing. ... That would be me. Corwin's voice softened with what might have been genuine affection. You always were too proud for your own good, cousin. Why? The word burst from Draven like a dam breaking. Why would everyone believe I was dead if I wasn't? Corwin's expression grew carefully neutral. There was an explosion at Chickamauga. A shell hit your position directly. Found your uniform, your watch, even part of your sword. No body, but he shrugged. After 3 days in the Georgia heat, with the carrion birds, we assumed the worst, but I survived. Apparently Corwin's eyes glittered strangely in the lamplight. Though I confess, cousin, I'm curious about the circumstances of that survival. It's quite remarkable, really, how completely you disappeared. Something in his tone made Isolde's skin crawl. She studied Corwin's face and saw calculation there, wheels turning behind his pale eyes. This wasn't just a happy reunion between cousins. There was something else, something darker. Before she could voice her suspicions, the sound of approaching cavalry echoed through the night. Forrest's main force was arriving, and with it would come questions, investigations, and the unraveling of every secret that had kept them all alive. Draven looked from Corwin to Isolde. It's the photograph that had shattered his borrowed life. Like glass. What happens now? He asked quietly. Corwin smiled, and in that smile, Isolde saw the promise of destruction. Now, dear cousin, you come home to face the consequences of rising from the dead. The thunder of cavalry grew louder until it filled the cave like an approaching storm, but Isolde's attention remained fixed on Corwin's predatory smile. Something was terribly wrong about this reunion, the way his eyes glittered with satisfaction. Rather than relief, the calculated timing of his arrival, just as Draven's memory began to stir. There's no time for lengthy explanations, Corwin announced as horses' hooves clattered outside. Forrest's men will be here momentarily, and they'll have questions about why a Confederate major is consorting with Yankees and deserters. Doctor, Ravenshade bristled. These are wounded men, not deserters. Corwin's gaze swept the cave's occupants with cold assessment. I see several able-bodied men who should be carrying rifles instead of lounging in caves. Here nor there, he turned back to Draven. Can you ride, cousin? Draven tested his weight against Isolde's shoulder, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing wound. I can manage. Excellent. We leave immediately. Wait. Isolde stepped between them, her heart hammering against her ribs. Where are you? Taking him home naturally, to Ashwin Hall, where he belongs. Corwin's smile never wavered, where his wife is waiting. The word wife hit Isolde like a physical blow. Of course, Margaret Starcrest, the Richmond belle in the photograph. The woman with every legal and moral claim to the man Isolde had loved since childhood. The woman who'd stolen Draven away even before the war had claimed him. "I should stay," Draven said quietly, his eyes finding Isolde's face, "until I remember more. This woman Aliro, she's been caring for me, how touching." Corwin's voice dripped with false sympathy. "But I'm afraid duty calls. Cousin, your father is dying. He's been asking for you these past months, though." All believed him to be speaking with ghosts. The revelation staggered Draven. "My father. Consumption took hold last winter. The doctors give him weeks, perhaps days." Corwin paused, letting the weight of guilt settle on Draven's shoulders. "He's been calling your name in his delirium. Perhaps seeing you alive will grant him peace before the end." Isolde watched Draven's face crumble under the burden of obligation, and lost time. She wanted to scream that it was manipulation, that Corwin was using his weakness against him. But what if the old man really was dying? What right did she have to keep a son from his father's deathbed? The cavalry sounds reached the cave entrance, voices shouting orders. Leather creaking, the metallic jingle of sabers and spurs. A figure appeared in the doorway, tall and imposing, in the lamplight. Major Blackthorn. The voice carried the authority of command. "Report Colonel Forrest." Corwin snapped to attention. "Cave secure, sir. Mostly Confederate wounded. A few Union sympathizers who fled when our scouts arrived." Nathan Bedford Forrest himself stepped into the cave, his legendary presence filling the space like electricity before lightning. His dark eyes swept the wounded men with a commander's practiced assessment, cataloging who could fight, who could ride, who was beyond help. "Good." His gaze settled on Draven with interest. "And this officer?" "My cousin, sir. Captain Draven Ashwind, reported killed at Chickamauga. Turns out the reports were greatly exaggerated." Forrest studied Draven with the intensity of a man who'd built his reputation on reading people quickly and accurately. "You look like hell, Captain. Fit to ride?" "Yes, sir." Draven straightened despite his obvious pain. "Memory problems, Colonel," Corwin interjected smoothly. "Took a bad blow to the head. Doesn't remember his unit or much else. It's common enough." Forrest's voice carried gruff sympathy. "Seen plenty of good men scrambled by shell shock. Usually comes back in time." He turned to Dr. Ravenshade. "Doctor, I'm commandeering this hospital. My boys need tending, and the Yankees will be back with reinforcements by dawn. Guys." As Forrest's men began filing into the cave, dirty, exhausted soldiers who'd been riding hard for days, Isolde felt her world contracting around her. In the chaos of military efficiency, she was becoming invisible, just another camp follower to be overlooked or discarded. "Draven," she called softly. He turned at the sound of his real name, confusion flickering across his features. "You know who I am?" The question in his voice demanded truth, but before she could answer, Corwin stepped between them. "Come, cousin. Horses are waiting, and we have miles to cover before daylight." "Wait." Draven's voice carried a note of command that made even Forrest look up with interest. "I want to know how she knows my name." Corwin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Does it matter? It's nobody a camp follower who's been amusing herself with wounded soldiers." The casual cruelty of the words made Draven's eyes flash with anger. "She saved my life. Show her respect." Of course, Corwin's smile became razor thin. "My apologies to the lady, but we really must go." Tota knew this was her last chance. Perhaps her only chance to tell Draven the truth before Corwin spirited him away to a life that would erase her completely. But surrounded by Confederate cavalry and with Forrest's piercing gaze upon them, the words stuck in her throat like stones. "I knew you before," she said finally. "Before the war. Before your marriage." Something flickered in Draven's eyes, recognition struggling against the fog of lost memory. How we were... ... She searched for words that wouldn't damn them both. "We were friends. Close friends. Corwin laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, my dear cousin. She's being far too modest." "Tell him the truth, Miss Nightshade." The use of her real name made Isolde's blood turn to ice. Corwin knew exactly who she was, had probably known from the moment he laid eyes on her. The trap he'd been weaving suddenly became clear, not just to reclaim Draven, but to destroy her. In the process, Yes, Corwin continued, his voice carrying across the cave for everyone to hear. Tell Captain Ashwind how you threw yourself at him for 2 years before his marriage. Tell him about the letters you wrote, the scenes you made, the way you begged him not to marry Miss Starcrest. Heat flooded Isolde's face as every eye in the cave turned toward her. Dr. Ravenshade looked stricken. The wounded soldiers watched with the avid interest of men starved for gossip, and Draven stared at her with growing horror. Tell him, Corwin. Pressed relentlessly, how you followed the army like a common camp whore after he chose duty and proper marriage over your affections. That's enough. Draven's voice cut through the cave like a saber stroke. Whatever happened between us before, she's shown me nothing but kindness here. Kindness? Corwin's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. Is that what you call it when a woman lies about her identity, claims to be your wife, and fills your head with false memories? She's been playing with you, cousin? It's taking advantage of your condition for her own twisted satisfaction? The words hit their mark, as Isolde watched doubt creep into Draven's eyes like poison spreading through clear water. Every tender moment between them, the gentle touches, the shared meals, the kiss that had saved his life suddenly looked sordid and manipulative in Corwin's cruel light. Is it true? Draven asked quietly. Did you lie about who you were? Isolde's throat closed around the words she needed to say. Yes, she'd lied, but not for the reasons Corwin suggested. She'd lied to protect him, to save him from Union capture, to guard his heart from the pain of remembering a love that had ended in betrayal. But how could she explain that to a man who didn't remember loving her? Answer him, Corwin demanded. Before Isolde could speak, the cave erupted in gunfire. Union cavalry had arrived in force, their carbines spitting flame as they charged the entrance. Forrest's men dove for cover behind rocks and supply crates, returning fire with deadly precision. Move, move. Forrest bellowed over the chaos. Fall back to the secondary positions. In the confusion of battlemen screaming, horses screaming, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the air, Corwin grabbed Draven's arm and began dragging him toward a side passage that led deeper into the mountain. This way, cousin. There's another exit. Draven looked back desperately as Corwin pulled him away. Elira. Well, she started after them, but a Union soldier blocked her path, his rifle raised. Stay where you are, miss. This is a military operation. The smoke and chaos, she saw Draven disappearing into the darkness of the mountain's depths. Corwin's hand on his shoulder like a spider guiding a fly into its web. The last thing she heard was Draven calling her name, not Isolde, but Elira, the false identity that had become more real than her own. As Union soldiers secured the cave and began tending their wounded, Isolde sank to her knees beside the abandoned soup kettle, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her like a house of cards. Dr. Ravenshade knelt beside her, her voice gentle but urgent. Child, there's something you need to know about Major Blackthorne, something I should have told you before. Isolde looked up through her tears. What? 3 years ago, when the telegram came about Draven's death? Corwin Blackthorne was the one. Who delivered it? Talia's voice dropped to a whisper. But I was there when it arrived, child. I saw the look on his face when he read those words. What kind of look? Satisfaction, Thalia said grimly. Pure satisfaction. Like a man who'd just gotten exactly what he wanted. The implication hit Isolde like a physical blow. If Corwin had wanted Draven dead 3 years ago, what did he want now that his cousin had inconveniently returned to life? And what would he do to ensure his plans weren't disrupted a second time? The revelation burned through Isolde like wildfire. If Corwin had wanted Draven dead 3 years ago, then his cousin's miraculous return wasn't a blessing. It was a threat to whatever schemes had flourished in Draven's absence. I have to warn him, Isolde whispered, scrambling to her feet despite the Union soldiers securing the cave around them. Dr. Ravenshade caught her arm. Child, you'll never reach them. Corwin knows these mountains, and he has a head start. Then I'll follow the roads to Virginia, to Ashwind Hall. And arrive to find what? Draven's memory restored and his wife at his side. Talia's voice carried gentle brutality. What claim do you have on him then? The question cut deeper than any blade. What claim indeed? Margaret Starcrest wore his ring, bore his name, had legal and moral right to his future. Isolde was nothing but a ghost from his past, a woman he'd chosen duty over, love he'd abandoned for social expectation. But as she stared into the mountain passage where Draven had disappeared, another truth crystallized in her heart. She loved him enough to let him go, but she loved him too much to let Corwin destroy him, ma'am. A Union lieutenant approached cautiously. We're evacuating the wounded to Murfreesboro. You're welcome to accompany us. Isolde barely heard him. Her mind was racing through possibilities, calculating distances and dangers. 3 days hard riding would take her to Virginia if she pushed through without rest. But she'd need a horse, supplies, and most importantly, proof of Corwin's treachery. Doctor, she said suddenly, gripping Talia's hand, those medical records you keep, you still have the report from when Draven was brought in? Of course. But what did it say about his injuries? Exactly. Talia frowned, accessing her professional memory. Gunshot wound to the shoulder, severe dehydration, fever from infection, but also ... double quotes. Her eyes widened with understanding.
Also.
Evidence of older injuries. Healed fractures to his ribs, scarring on his back, consistent with whip marks. Torture. Was my assessment? Yes. Someone had beaten him severely, probably repeatedly, before he ever reached that battlefield. The pieces clicked together like tumblers in a lock. Draven hadn't been killed at Chickamauga, he'd been captured, tortured, held prisoner somewhere while the world believed him dead. And who better to arrange such a thing than his own cousin, the man who'd delivered news of his death with satisfaction? Rather than grief? I need paper and ink, Isolde said urgently. And I need you to write down everything, every detail of his condition, every injury that couldn't have come from battle. As Thalia hurried to comply, Isolde began stripping out of her rough mountain dress and into the cleanest clothes she could find among the medical supplies. If she was going to Ashwin Hall, she'd arrive as a lady, not a camp follower. The ride to Virginia blurred into a nightmare of muddy roads and sleepless nights. Isolde pushed her borrowed horse to the edge of endurance, stopping only to rest the animal and gather information from innkeepers and fellow travelers. The war had left the countryside scarred and suspicious. But coins and a convincing story about seeking news of her missing brother opened enough doors to keep her moving forward. On the third day, as autumn mist clung to the Blue Ridge Mountains, she finally saw the white columns of Ashwin Hall rising through the trees like a vision from another world. The plantation house stood unchanged by WWII Monument 2, southern gentility that seemed to mock the devastation she'd witnessed in the mountains. Isolde approached the servants' entrance, knowing better than to present herself at the front door without invitation. A elderly woman in cook's whites answered her knock, her weathered face creased with suspicion. We ain't hiring, the woman said curtly. I'm not seeking employment. I bring urgent news about Master Draven. The cook's expression shifted to wary interest. Master Draven's been dead these 3 years, child. No, ma'am, he's alive. I've seen him. The kitchen door swung wider, revealing a spacious room where several house servants had stopped their work to listen. An older man in butler's livery stepped forward, his bearing dignified despite his obvious age. I am Tobias, head of household staff, he said formally. Perhaps you'd better come inside and explain yourself. Over cups of real coffee, a luxury Isolde had almost forgotten existed. She told her story to the assembled servants. She showed them Dr. Ravenshade's medical notes, described Draven's scars and mannerisms, spoke of his kindness even when memory failed him. It's him, the cook whispered, tears streaming down her dark cheeks. Lord have mercy, it's really him. Where's he now? Tobias asked. Major Blackthorn brought him home yesterday, Isolde said carefully. But I fear he means Draven harm. The servants exchanged meaningful glances. Tobias cleared his throat delicately. Major Blackthorn has been managing the estate since Master Draven's reported death. Stands to inherit everything if the young Master remains deceased. And if Draven's alive, then Major Blackthorn inherits nothing, said a young maid. Will's real specific about that. The motive crystallized with terrifying clarity. Corwin had arranged Raven's disappearance to claim his inheritance. It's probably been slowly poisoning the old master to speed his own ascension. Draven's inconvenient return threatened to expose everything. "Where is Master Draven now?" Isolde asked. "In the East Wing," Tobias said quietly. "Major Blackthorn says he's still recovering from his injuries, needs rest and quiet, won't let anyone see him, not even Miss Margaret. His wife is here. Arrived this morning when word spread that Master Draven had returned. She's in the parlor now, arguing with Major Blackthorn about visiting rights." Through the kitchen windows came the sound of raised voices, a woman's angry tones clashing with Corwin's smooth deflections. Isolde rose from her chair, purpose crystallizing. In her chest, like steel cooling in water. "Can you get me to the East Wing without being seen?" Tobias studied her face with shrewd eyes. "What are you planning, miss?" "To save the man I love, even if he can never be mine." The old butler nodded slowly. "This way." Servants' corridors of Ashwind Hall were a maze of narrow passages and hidden stairs. It's designed to let staff move invisibly through the grand house. Tobias led her through the skeleton of the mansion, past portraits of Ashwind ancestors who stared down with painted disapproval. "Here," he whispered, stopping before a concealed door. "This opens into Master Draven's childhood room. Major Blackthorn chose it specifically. No outside windows, only one entrance. A prison." "Exactly." Isolde pressed her ear to the door and heard voices within Draven's weaker tones and Corwin's smooth responses. They were discussing something urgent, their voices too low to make out words. She eased the door open just enough to peer inside. Draven sat in a chair by the fireplace, looking pale but alert. Corwin stood before him holding a glass of what looked like medicine, his back to the hidden entrance. "Father's condition has worsened," Corwin was saying. "This tonic will help. Restore your strength before you see him." Isolde's blood turned to ice. The liquid in the glass was too dark, too thick. "Not medicine, poison. Drink it all," Corwin urged. "Every drop." Draven raised the glass toward his lips, and Isolde burst through the door like an avenging angel. "Don't drink that." "Oh." Both men spun toward her. Draven's face lit with confused joy, but Corwin's expression twisted with rage and something else, fear. "Isolde," Draven whispered. "You," Corwin snarled. "How did you, the same way I learned the truth about Chickamauga," she said, pulling Dr. Ravenshade's medical report from her bodice. "About the torture scars on his back, the broken ribs, the evidence that someone held him prisoner while you told the world he was dead." Draven looked from the glass in his hand to his cousin's face, understanding dawning like terrible sunrise. She's lying," Corwin said desperately. "She's obsessed with you, has been for years." "She'll say anything the servants know," Isolde interrupted. "They're already spreading word through the county that you tried to poison the rightful heir." "How long before the sheriff arrives to investigate?" Through the house came the sound of doors slamming, voices raised in alarm and accusation. Margaret's voice rose above the rest, demanding answers. Demanding to see her husband. Corwin's hand moved toward his sidearm, but Draven was faster despite his injuries. 3 years of surviving as a prisoner had honed instincts that memory loss couldn't erase. He threw the poisoned glass aside and tackled his cousin to the floor, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. "The war's over, Corwin," he said quietly as they struggled. "For both of us." Later, as Corwin was led away in chains and the truth spread through Ashwind Hall like wildfire, Isolde stood in the garden watching the last roses of autumn bloom against the approaching winter. Draven found her there, his arm in a proper sling, but his eyes clear with returning memory. "I remember," he said simply. "Everything, including what I owe you." She turned to face him, this man she'd loved and lost and found again. "You owe me nothing. You have a wife, a life to rebuild. Margaret and I, ... double quotes, he paused, choosing words carefully. "We've spoken. The woman who married me 3 years ago isn't the same woman who waited through my death. Neither of us is the same person we were." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that," Sometimes the dead get a second chance at living. He stepped closer, hope and uncertainty warring in his eyes. If they're brave enough to take it, Isolde looked at the roses blooming impossibly late, defying season and scents to offer beauty. In the face of winter, sometimes she thought the most unlikely things were the ones that endured. "What did you call me before?" she asked, remembering that night in the cave when he'd known her without knowing why. "Angel," Draven said, his voice soft with wonder. "My angel with the soup." She smiled then, tasting hope on her lips like honey. "I prefer Isolde." If this tale of love surviving the grave has stirred your heart, pray tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to share this story with those who believe in second chances. Where are you watching from today? Tell us your corner of this wide world, for love knows no borders and hope speaks every language.